Good morning. You know, this has nothing to do with the message, but I've got a curious question to myself I've been asking myself. Something that I see every Sunday, but if you're sitting out there, you never see. If you actually come back here and you look at the back of the pulpit, on the bottom of the back of the pulpit, somebody has taken a large, and years ago, took a large black magic marker and drew a big arrow pointing down on the back of the pulpit. And my question is this to tell the people which side is up? I hope not, but in any event, it just looks very strange when you sit back here and see it every week and wonder who put it there and why they put it there. There's probably a reason, but I don't know it. One of the things we want to look at, we're back in Galatians again today, and we're starting in chapter 1, verse 11. There's no chapter 11 in Galatians. And one of the things we want to look at in Galatians is, what have we seen so far? Well, so far this is a very emotional book. And it's an emotional book by Paul because he's upset because the people in Galatia are now teaching a false gospel. And remember from last week, this wasn't just another gospel of the same kind. This is a completely different type of gospel. This is where we talked about the word heteros and allos and how they related to each other. It is a completely different type of gospel, and Paul is upset. And what we're going to see today, we actually took, if you look at it, I've got verse 11 through 24. Now, normally, we don't do 14 verses in one morning. The reason we're doing 14 verses is because these 14 verses need to stay together. They have one theme and one thing in common, which is to show that the gospel, where the gospel came from, that Paul was actually preaching. So that's the context we're leading up to right now. One of the interesting things I remember back many years, I remember being in a room, and I remember having 50 people arguing with me. It's not fun, let me tell you. And I had one opinion, and the other 50 had another opinion. And I knew I was right. And worse yet, I had a tape recording of the original event we were arguing about, and I knew I was right because I had the tape recording. And I knew that what these 50 people were saying, they had convinced themselves was true, but was not true. And later on, some of them actually admitted to me when they heard the tape, you're right, the 50 was wrong, the one was right. But the interesting thing to me was, when I look back on that, is I had the source. I had the direct tape itself, and I heard it personally too. I had that tape to tell me what the truth was. Every one of those 50 had heard it filtered through a few people. It's ever like, do you remember the game we all play? I thought about doing it here in church today, but decided not to. The game where, you sit in a circle and you start telling a story, and, the story starts with, I was 11 years old and I went to an airport. And it finishes with something like, and John flew an airplane when he was 11 years old. Something like that, okay? That's the same situation that Paul's trying to avoid here. What Paul's trying to actually say here is, I got the gospel directly from God. I didn't get it from man, I got it from God. And that's where this gospel came from that I'm teaching. Now let's go ahead and turn to verse 11. And one thing I want to say is that as you look at today's verses, today's section, verses 12 through 24, every one of those verses should be related back to verse 11. Because they all are telling one thing. That thing is, the gospel didn't come from man. The gospel came from God. And if we look at verse 11, it says, For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. That one key phrase in the end, not according to man. This not only is something that man didn't make up, but as Paul's going to explain, this is something where he didn't get it from other men and have it passed along. It wasn't that game in the circle where it kept getting transmitted and changed as it went along. He got it straight from Jesus Christ. Now, why is this important? Because this whole argument is trying to tell these people in Galatia, you guys have a false gospel you're teaching. If Paul can't stand there and say, I have the true gospel, then it's meaningless for him to say you have the false gospel. So the first thing Paul has to do is establish his credibility in that he is the authority in this case. And that's what all of these verses are going to be doing. Now if we look at verse 12. Verse 12 said, For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Didn't receive it from man. Okay, where did it come from? Well, he's going to answer that in a minute. But in addition, he said, not only did I not receive it from man, but nobody taught me this. Why is that important? The importance of it is that there was no interference. It was a pure gospel that he got directly from Christ. And when we look at this word revelation, a lot of times we have misunderstandings about this word because we think of the book of Revelation and turmoil. And the word revelation really means to lay bare, to disclose the truth, or as we have it, it's a revelation. And in this case, it's a revelation from Jesus Christ. Now, why is it important that it comes from Jesus Christ? Linda and I have a painting that we bought many years ago. We've actually bought a number of paintings at auctions. And we bought paintings where people didn't know what was being auctioned off. And we've gotten them very cheap. We have some very well-known paintings that we got very cheap because they were in local auctions. They weren't art auctions. They were auctions where nobody knew what they were. She was a lot smarter than I was on this stuff. She said, look. And I said, yeah, you're right. So anyway, we bought these paintings. One of them that we bought, we believe may be painted by a 16th century Italian master. Okay? We've had Christie's look at it. We've had Sotheby's look at it. There's a partial label on the back of it which shows that I think it was in 1806. It was actually sold as part of a famous collection and attributed to this Italian master from the 16th century, painted back in the late 1500s, supposedly. Here's the problem. That painting is worth a lot of money, or it's a curiosity worth nothing. You know what separates the two? One thing. And the one reason why we haven't sold this painting, because trust me, it's a cool painting. If we found out this sucker was valuable and we could sell it, it's out the door. Okay? Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't last 4 minutes. The reason we can't sell this painting is something called provenance. Provenance is what paintings have which says, so-and-so owned it and sold it to so-and-so. So-and-so owned it and sold it to so-and-so. And it goes on and on and on, right back to the artist who actually painted it. And you can trace the entire painting back, all the way back. If a painting doesn't have provenance, it can be a legitimate painting. And it's worthless. And believe it or not, there are some forgeries that have good provenances that sell for big money. It's one of the reasons why I believe the art market is, to a large degree, a rigged game. But the point is, everything that matters is who is the original author of or artist on this painting, and how can you prove it? Same thing with the gospel. That's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying the gospel, what's important here is that I got the gospel directly from Jesus Christ. No interference. The provenance of it is God did it. That's a pretty good provenance. And that's what Paul was saying is, I got the gospel straight from God. That's my provenance, Jesus Christ. Now, if you start looking at verses 13 through 24, I want to talk about the whole section for a minute before we look at the individual verses. One of the questions you might have is, why are these verses here? And not only that, these verses look more like a travel blog in a lot of cases than they do Bible verses. Yeah, I went to Damascus, I went to Syria, I went to Cilicia, I went to, I almost expect somewhere in here to Paul say, yeah, remember to check out the Holiday Inn in Damascus or something. That's what it sounds like. But there is a reason for every single one of these verses, and they're important, including where he went to. They mean something. The first thing you're going to find in the entire section here is that these sections are intended to establish Jesus Christ as Paul's authority. That it was a direct gospel from Christ and not from man. The second thing these verses are going to establish is that Paul is the known authority on legalism, on the law, and on Judaism, and also on Christianity. And he should be listened to as well because he is the authority. As a matter of fact, Paul was at his day probably the foremost expert on Judaism in the world. Certainly one of the foremost. And therefore he was qualified to say, I know both gospels and you have abandoned the true gospel. Now let's take a look at the verses specifically and see how we get to this. If we look at verse 13, it says, For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. All right, let's go on to 14. And I was advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. The first thing we want to see here is that Paul was qualified in the Jewish law and knew what he was talking about. Because remember, the gospel that was being brought by these Galatians was the Mosaic law being overlaid on the grace of Christ. And Paul's saying he's an expert. Now, not only that, if you look at verse 13, it says in the New American Standard, my former manner of life. Some versions will say my conduct. That probably doesn't really capture what that's trying to say. And fortunately, I have an in-house Greek expert who pointed this out to me this week. And my in-house Greek expert said, you need to take a look at that word more closely. And I did. And she was right. That manner of life phrase is talking about turning something on its head completely, and it's an all-consuming essence of your being. So that's what it's really saying there, is that it wasn't just his former manner of life, it was completely all-consuming. Judaism was all-consuming to Paul. It wasn't just, I go to synagogue on Saturdays. It was everything in his life had to do with Judaism. He was, and I say this reverently and respectfully, but he was Mr. Jew of his day. If we continue looking at these verses, it says in verse 14 that I was advancing in Judaism beyond my contemporaries. Advancing in Judaism probably should be seen as by leaps and bounds over these other people. He wasn't just a little bit better. He was the star pupil who was rising, the rising star. This was the guy who, again, was at the top of the heap. So at this point in time, what Paul is saying is, when it comes to the law, when it comes to the Mosaic law, when it comes to Judaism, I know this stuff. I was number one king of the heap on the Judaism scale and on the law scale, and knew this stuff, and therefore I am qualified to tell you that your gospel is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. So combining that with the fact that he got his gospel straight from Christ, it makes a compelling case. Now if we go to verse 15. Verse 15 is where we see God's intervention in all of this. When Paul says, but when he who had set me apart, even from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace was pleased. And yes, it should continue on for, and everybody, when I see that verse, I want to complete it, but we're going to leave verse 16 for the moment. The first thing I want to see in verse 15 is, he was called from the womb. The point being, God didn't get caught by surprise. It wasn't like Paul grew up, got to a teenager, and God said, that guy would make a good apostle to the Gentiles. Maybe we should do that with. No, God knew about it before Paul was even born. This didn't catch God by surprise. He specifically set Paul apart to do this job. He knew about it. He knew what was going to happen there. It wasn't a surprise to God. Secondly, it says that he was called from the womb and called me through his grace. Remember, Paul is the expert in the law. How was Paul called to God? How was Paul called to be an apostle to the Gentiles? By God's grace. Again, emphasizing grace in this message. And not only that, but we can also see that God chose the time of when this was going to happen. Because it says, when he was pleased to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach to the Gentiles. Let me ask you a question and think about this for a minute. If you were God, okay, might not you have converted Paul maybe like 5 or 10 years earlier? Would have saved a lot of lives. I mean, let's face it, Paul was the number one killer of Christians in the ancient world. Paul was like the Jewish equivalent of ISIS running through the ancient world, going after the Christians, beheading them. Right now, we have brothers and sisters in Christ being killed every week. And they're making videos of it. And they're drowning them, and they're cutting their heads off, and they're doing all kinds of stuff to them that I won't even describe. Paul was doing that to the Christians back then. Paul was the champion of that. And I'm saying to myself, if I were God, I think that conversion would have come like maybe 10 years sooner, save a number of lives, get more Christians in the pot, getting things stirred up. God didn't do it. God chose the time specifically. And I got to shake my head at this. But you know something? Right off the bat, I can tell you a couple things about that time. Number one, God used Paul to disperse the gospel. Now, I'm not just talking about Paul after he was saved. I'm talking about Paul before he was saved, while he was a murderer. He was using Paul to disperse the gospel. And you're like, how did he use Paul to disperse the gospel? Simple. When Jesus Christ died, you had the church in Jerusalem. The Jews were persecuting the church. The Romans, they didn't care about it. As far as they were concerned, it was a sect of Judaism. No big deal. You guys are fine. Do what you want. We don't care. Just don't screw with the Roman government, and we don't care what you do. Well, here's the point. The Jews of that day were very content to stay in Jerusalem. They wanted to have Jerusalem as the heart of the church. They would have just sat there. Guess who got them moving to the uttermost parts of the earth? Let me say this. When you put a mass murderer serial killer in your midst who is after you in particular, it will get people to move. That's what Paul was to them. Paul was this murderer sitting here hunting down the Christians, and some of these Christians who were in Jerusalem suddenly said, Galatia, Syria, whatever, that's starting to look pretty good out there. Paul was used by God to spread the gospel while he was a murderer. Now, I'm not endorsing what Paul was doing, and God wasn't either. But the point is, God can use horrible incidents in order to spread his word. And that was happening, and God, again, this was all part of God's plan. God didn't get caught by surprise. It wasn't like, oh, dang, I wish I would have converted him earlier. No, he knew what was going on. Now, in addition to that, something else to remember is God always had a plan for Paul. This wasn't something where, again, God changed his mind. God knew right from the start what he was going to do. First, he was use him to disperse the believers. Then he was going to use him to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. God knew that. He didn't get surprised. Now, if we look at verse 16, it says, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. A couple interesting things in here to start with. The first thing I see is, to reveal his Son in me. Christ was being revealed in Paul by Paul's actions, by his words. Everything about Paul was bleeding out Jesus Christ. That looking at Paul, people could see Christ. That was the whole idea. And not only that, but Paul's conversion, being so dramatic, proved what God had done and thereby glorified God. I mean, let's face it, it's wonderful when a good person that you know and you love and you care about, and he's nice to bunnies and he never kicks the dog and he brings flowers to his wife and everything else, and that person gets saved, you rejoice and he's part of heaven. Nothing wrong with that. And that's wonderful. But when a guy who's a serial killer or a mass murderer converts over and really changes his life and spreads the gospel, you go, wow. That's more the type of conversion Paul had, and by doing this conversion, he was glorifying God and proving who God was. So he was demonstrating God through his life. So that's what it means when it says to reveal his Son in me. In addition to that, he says that I might preach him among the Gentiles. First off, Paul was called specifically as an apostle to the Gentiles, which is kind of strange if you think about it, because Paul was the foremost expert in Judaism in the entire world. God knew best. In truth, one of the things I love reading the books like Galatians and Romans and Ephesians and Colossians, the works of Paul especially, okay? And you know why I love reading them? They appeal to me because of the logic of them. I've gone through Romans, for example, and found in Romans, the entire book is one giant argument right up through the beginning of chapter 12. And then after that, there's some other suggestions, but the point is that it's one beautifully woven argument. It's not a chapter on this and it's not a chapter on salvation and then a chapter on what happens with the Jewish salvation and a chapter on... That's not how it's laid out. The entire thing is one argument. It's like reading a lawyer's brief by a lawyer who really knows what he's doing. I used to read a lot of briefs when I worked in the law firm for a couple of years. And what would happen would be that you'd see some briefs and you go, and this guy's a lawyer? And then you'd see other ones and you go, wow, this guy nailed it. That's what I see in Paul's writings. This is a personal opinion here, but I believe one of the reasons for that is because historically, if you look at that time, the Greeks, as they called it, a lot of the Gentiles were the Greek thinking, and the Jewish thinking, the Greeks would have the appeal of logic to them. And honestly, as a Gentile, Paul's writing appeals to me because it's logical to me. I love reading that. And that's a personal opinion, but maybe that's why God made Paul the apostle to the Gentiles. Because he realized that. The other thing you've got to realize is that by doing this, the gospel was opened up to the entire world. First by Paul dispersing the people, then by Paul bringing the gospel to the people. Now remember, all of this is still relating back to verse 11, which is saying that it was a gospel not according to man. This is Paul bringing Christ's words directly to the people. Now, the other thing you're going to see in verse 16 is it says, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. It's kind of a deceptive little way this is set up here, because if you look at it, most people just associate immediately with consult with flesh and blood. But if you looked at the connecting words, the first one is ude, which is neither or nor, and then allo, which is but, and you look at it and go, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, neither or nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. The point being is that word immediately is saying all three of those things were immediate. That and I don't mean that second, but the first things that Paul did was A, B, and C, these three things right here. And that word grammatically should really be linked to all three of them, not just to the first one. Now if we look at this, the important thing is, it says, number one, did not consult with flesh and blood. Why is that important? Everybody here probably already knows that because I've said it here. It's important because it wasn't man telling him what the gospel was. It wasn't coming from man. It was a direct channel from Jesus Christ to God. I believe on the Damascus Road that Paul's eyes were opened up and Paul saw the gospel, heard it from Jesus Christ, and converted right then and there. But it was a pure gospel from Christ. Secondly, did not visit the other apostles. Jerusalem was the center of the church. He didn't go to Jerusalem. He went to Damascus, he went to Arabia, then he went to Damascus. Second time. First he went to Damascus Road. Point being is, why does it say he didn't consult with the other apostles? Does it mean the other apostles were evil or they were wrong? No, of course not. The other apostles were fine. It's just that there was no way somebody could say, you went and got your gospel from another guy. Now why is that important? Again, verse 11, not according to man, and then go back to the context. The context is Paul telling them, you have the wrong gospel, I have the right gospel. With that being the context, it's again critical that Paul established this didn't come from even the other apostles. This comes straight from Jesus Christ. Again, the best provenance you can have. If you're selling a painting and the painting is straight from God, that's the painting I would buy. If it's a gospel and it's straight from God, that's the gospel you want. Nothing better than getting it straight from God. Now, the third thing, if you look at here, is he said in verse 17, immediately I went to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Now, I've actually changed my mind on what these verses mean here over time. Actually, this week in studying it, I've changed my mind. I believed in the past that God actually was teaching Paul in Arabia and training him in Arabia. I don't think that's actually what was happening here. I'll tell you why. There's a couple of reasons. Number one, I think he was actually an apostle to the Gentiles, preaching to the gospel to the Gentiles that first week. At first he stopped in the synagogues to try to teach them. They turned him away, so he went to but that was real quick, that happened. The point is, I think what happened is he was immediately preaching. And you might say, well, wait a second, how could he immediately be preaching without learning? The fact is, Paul had learned. Paul had spent his entire life learning the gospel. He turned away from it. But the Old Testament has the Bible in, or has the gospel in it as much as the New Testament does. Because the problem was the Old Testament, the people were saying, we have the law, as long as we follow the law, we're in. Or we're the chosen people, we're in. That's not the Old Testament's gospel. The Old Testament is, the law is here to show you certain things that will lead you to the Messiah which is to come. The Old Testament salvation was always by the Messiah. There was never a salvation. Salvation has never been by the law, ever. It's always been by the Messiah. When Paul became a convert, Paul was an instant religious expert. He knew he could figure out the New Testament and figure out what Jesus Christ said because he already knew the prophecies of the Old Testament. It wasn't a surprise to him. I bet Paul didn't say, oh wow, he was born in Bethlehem. I didn't know that. Of course he knew it because the Old Testament said he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Paul knew all these things. He would have been an instant expert. And Paul could have, I'm not saying he didn't get more training, but Paul could have immediately started teaching at that point in time. He immediately became an apostle to the Gentiles. It's funny, one of the things that I remember over and over again is, I've talked about him before, but my brother-in-law. And phenomenal guy. Loves the Lord. Him and his wife love the Lord. And one of the things, though, that you need to know about my brother-in-law is he became a convert at about 40 years old. Up until then, he grew up with an independent Baptist pastor as a father and learned to hate the gospel and hate Christians, primarily because of the legalism that he saw. But he despised Christians. And he, not only that, but he despised Christians enough that he set as his goal, and he told me this face to face, his goal was to destroy Christians and destroy their lives. Matter of fact, it was not only his goal, but he studied over and over and over, day in and day out. He studied apologetics. He studied the Bible. Why? In order to help people? In order to convert? No, in order to destroy Christians' lives. Because he felt that if he knew the Bible and he knew apologetics better than they could, he could destroy them and destroy their faith. He did it for 40 years. Well, he started as an infant. Obviously, he didn't start then. But the point is, until he was 40 years old, he did this. You know what happened? God came to him miraculously in his case and saved him in the middle of the night. And almost instantly, this guy had close to a seminary-level education because he hated Christ. Yeah, I know, it's funny. Him and I can sit there and talk about stuff that I can talk to very few other people about. I love it when him, me, and Linda and a few other people get together in Canada and stuff and start discussing some of this stuff, because it's just like, it's wonderful to have these conversations. But what's happening is, he's already at a level where I learn quite a bit from him by talking to him. We learn from each other. We challenge each other. Why? Because he spent all those years hating Christians. God knew what was going to happen to him, and God has used all of that. But in the same way, he literally could start witnessing to people the first day he got saved with an expert level of knowledge. Everybody can witness the first day, but he could witness with an expert level because he learned it beforehand. Paul was the same way. There was no one in Judaism that knew the gospel better than Paul, that knew the law better than Paul. He knew all this stuff because he was an instant expert. And that's one of the things that made him so valuable to God. Now, if we continue looking at the verses, in verse 18 it says, "Then 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days." Critical here to look at the fact 3 years later. Remember, this is 3 years after Paul's conversion, and Paul still hasn't talked to any of the apostles. Paul still hasn't gone to Jerusalem either. Hasn't gone to the center of the gospel. Why? Why is he saying all this stuff? Normally you wouldn't brag about this. And I didn't affiliate with any of my fellow believers, and I went off on my own and did what I was going to. No, that's not what he's saying. What he's trying to say is, guys, you want to criticize this gospel and tell me I'm wrong. Look, I have the pure gospel from Jesus Christ that did not come from anyone else. You can't tell me it came from other men. You can't tell me it came from Jerusalem. It's the pure gospel. So when I tell you you have a heteros gospel, a gospel of a completely different kind, I know what I'm talking about. That's what Paul was saying. And that's why Paul had this stuff isn't in here just to give a biography of Paul. This is in here specifically to the Galatians to tell the Galatians, look, you guys need to understand this is a pure gospel. That's why it's here. And that's why it's talked about 3 years there. When he went to Jerusalem, what did he do? He met 2 of the apostles. 15 days he stayed with, we believe Cephas was actually Peter. And he also then met James, the brother of Jesus Christ. Even at that point in time, he only met 2 of the apostles, and only for 15 days. And then what happens in verse 20, it says, "Now in what I am writing to you, I assure you before God that I am not lying." Now I have to admit, when I saw this verse, my first thought was, what? What are you talking about? This verse looks like it just don't belong there. It's that simple, okay? I mean, if I'm going through and I'm saying to somebody, hey, I'm going through a whole story and also like, hey, and I assure you, I am not lying. It's like, why are you saying that? It almost calls into question what you're saying, okay? It's a strange thing to say, but I think one of the things we're seeing here is we're not really getting the full measure of in the English of what we're seeing in the Greek, okay? Because one thing in the Greek, there's a word in here where it says, I assure you, in the English, I assure you before God that I am not lying. I assure you is way too weak a word there. The Greek word is actually edu. And this word is the same word when Jesus showed up. You go, edu. They go, behold. That's the way we normally translate that word. Behold. Hey, it's Jesus. Look, he's here. That's a word that shows emotion. It's a strong word. So what Paul is saying is this is an emotional word, not just I assure you. It's not like taking a legal document, testimony or something. Instead, it's Paul saying, look, I am not lying. I am swearing before God to this for you. He's saying it because he's getting so emotionally wrapped up in this first chapter. Actually, he didn't call it a chapter then, actually. It was a letter. But he's getting so emotionally wrapped up, he's saying, look, I am not lying. I swear before God. It's almost like just saying, Look, please pay attention. That's why this verse is here. That's why this verse looks out of place at first. And you know what the other thing this verse does? This verse forces the Galatians to make a choice. Okay? When someone comes to you and said, I am here with a message from God, directly from God for you. Okay? You got two choices. Number one, no way, get out of here. Or number two, okay, it's from God. I better do something about it. Paul's message is, I'm here right from God. And you cannot, there is no wiggle room in that. It's either true completely or false completely. And I think verse 20 is putting the Galatians on the spot where Paul is getting emotional about this, and he's telling them, look, make a choice, guys. You're going to follow me in God, or you're going to go the other way with your legalism. Take your pick. That's what verse 20 is really doing with this. Again, it's all related back to verse 11 with the gospel is not according to man. Now, when we look at 21 through 23, here's where we get to the travel blog section of Paul's writing, where Paul starts saying, Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown to the sight of the churches of Judea which were in Christ, but only they kept hearing, He who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy. The important thing to realize is, number one, if we look at where these places are, Syria, and not only that, if you look at the 3 years before that, Arabia. Arabia is almost certainly Saudi Arabia today. That whole peninsula down there. Probably Saudi Arabia, Yemen, that whole area he's talking about. If you know geography, you know that's got nothing to do with Jerusalem. It's a totally different section. Even though it's all Middle East, it's a whole different section. If you look at Syria, Syria is where the war's going on today. Syria is where ISIS has a lot of their headquarters and things like that. Syria is, the point is Syria is north of Jerusalem and separated. And the point being is Syria, again, is another country. It's not part of Jerusalem. Cilicia is actually south-central Turkey today. South-central Turkey, which would have been called Asia Minor back then, is again separated partly by not by the Mediterranean there, kind of a finger of it, but separated a good distance from Jerusalem. Why is he saying all these things? Because every one of these things is saying, I was not getting the gospel from the guys who know the gospel. I got it from Jesus Christ. It's funny, but 11 through 24 is one message. This is from God. That's the message. Now, if we look at it also, what's interesting is in 21 through 23, these churches had no contact with Paul, and even when he showed up in Cilicia and when he showed up in the other places he mentioned, they didn't know who he was by sight. But what they did know was, this is the guy who was murdering all the Christians, but now we've heard has completely changed his life. There was a testimony there. There was probably a tad bit of fear there too, but honestly, he had already been 3 years without killing Christians at least, so I think the fear had subsided. But they were excited because this is the guy, but they didn't know him. That's why he's saying this. He's saying they didn't know him to show him again. This is all coming straight from Jesus. Now, if we look at verse 24, and this is a wonderful verse, talking about in 23, it says, He who once persecuted is now preaching the faith, which he once tried to destroy. And 24, and they were glorifying God because of me. Paul's change caused the people around him to glorify God. Not only was he glorifying God, but he caused the other people around him. That's a wonderful statement to say. That there's such a change that the people could see this. Now, we've looked at the interpretation of these verses. Now the question is, what's it all mean? What's it mean to us? Because again, we're looking at what it meant literally to the people in the first century who were receiving this letter. And we got to do that first, because if we don't do that first, we have no right to talk about application from these verses. The first thing we can see is the gospel has power because it's from God, not from man. When we go out and tell somebody Jesus Christ is the propitiation and paid the price for God's wrath, and that if you believe on Him through His blood, you will be saved by faith in Christ and believe in His resurrection, we're talking about a message that came straight from God. Now, we didn't get a direct revelation from God, but we did get a revelation. We did get it from the Bible, which is God's being revealed to us. It came straight from God, and therefore it has power. Anything that man has made up, no power. It might be good sayings, but other religions, it's from man. And therefore, it does not have the power to save. It does not have the power to convert lives. People may do good things, but it doesn't have the power of the gospel. The gospel is unique because it is from God. One of the things that's funny also is, if you look at it, what I think we've got to say also is, it's not our words that give us the authority, it's God's word that gives us the authority. It's one of the reasons why I'm so big on interpretation before application. Because if I just stand up here and I tell you, you ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to do whatever, you would have every right to look at me and say, well, that's your opinion. And not only is that your opinion, but I got an opinion too, and maybe mine's just as good as yours is. That'd be a fair thing to say. That's why we go through the interpretation first, because I want to base my opinion on God's word, not on my word. If I'm basing it on me, great, another opinion. That's all we need. If I'm basing it on God's word, that's another story. It's funny, one of the things that I've laughed about over the years, I have 2 employees. And one of my employees I've had for 6, 7 years now. Wonderful guy, I mentioned before, named Caleb. And it's funny, I actually found Caleb. He was a part-time youth minister in a church I went to, and then worked for me part-time. Since then, for years, he's been a full-time employee. But he used to always say something to me that we would both laugh about. He would go tell a customer something, and he was dead on accurate. And if you know Caleb, his favorite word is dude. So Caleb would always start with, he'd go, dude, I told him that, and he didn't believe me. And you know what happened? Then he'd say, you call him. And I'd either phone him or I'd send him an email, and you know what they'd say? Oh, okay, thanks, we believe it. And the first thing Caleb would always get is, dude, I already told him that. And he's right. You know something? The only difference between what he told him and what I told him, it came from me instead of him. And at that time, they saw him as the junior guy, and they saw me as the senior guy. There's no difference. We were both right. But they saw that there was an authority there that they didn't associate with it. Now, today, as Caleb has grown, they see him as an authority, and that doesn't happen so much anymore. But for a number of years, and it frustrated the snot out of Caleb. And I could understand that. And with him and I said, I used to laugh about it, and so did he. Told him the exact same thing. Well, you know something? I'm an earthly authority. I don't have the power of God. But when we're talking about the power of the gospel coming from God, that makes the difference. If it's just coming from you or me, it's worthless. If it's coming from God, that changes everything. And all it means is, because it was a letter, not an email, it would have been nice to get a Bible in an email, but that's another story. Because it's a letter that came from God, because it's a book that came from God, it has meaning. That's why it's important. The second thing we can learn from this is God is in charge. It looked like I'm sure to the early Christians, they probably looked at things and said, boy, why isn't God getting rid of this guy, Paul? God knew what he was doing. Today, when I look at the Middle East, I have to admit, my solution were I got to the Middle East and people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS would be very different from how God has handled this. Because you wouldn't have to deal with ISIS or Al-Qaeda anymore. The fact is, for some reason, God has allowed this to go on. Now, that doesn't mean it's right. It means that God is allowing it to happen. The fact is, though, is that God is still in control. It's not like God sitting in heaven saying, oh, I wish I knew how to get rid of those terrorists. I just can't figure it out. He knows. Nothing surprises him. He understands it. And it is in his control and in his time that things are happening. But God is in charge and nothing surprises God. That's an application we can take from this because of what happened with Paul. When Paul was back there, hey, it may have looked like things were out of control. They weren't. And as tough as it is for me to say this, when we have things in our personal life that annoy us, I'm not saying we should just say they're okay. But there are things that happen that, frankly, we have to say, you know something? God's still in control, even though I know this person is out to lunch, okay? When we have those annoyances in our life, sometimes they're there for a reason. The third thing we can look at is, if you are a believer, just like Paul, God chose you. No accidental Christians, no grandchildren of Jesus or anything like that. Everyone who was a believer was chosen by God, and we can see that in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. And in addition to that, not only was everyone adopted by God and chosen by Him, but in addition to being chosen for adoption by God, adoption is something that can never be broken. There is no such thing as a disinherited adopted son to God. And interestingly enough, most adoption laws in the U.S. do not allow disinheriting an adopted child. Natural children, yes, but not adopted children. The reason is because they don't want the adopted children to be a second-class citizen. The fact is, as an adopted son of God and a daughter of God, we have every single right that a natural son of God would have. The difference is there are no natural children of God. Now, we call Jesus Christ the Son of God, and that's true, but we don't mean it in the same way as a normal man. Yes, He was a man, and yes, He was God, but He wasn't somebody that needed saving or something like that. He's still God. The point is, as far as humans on earth, there are no natural children of God. We're all adopted if we're children of God. But we can remember God did choose us, just like He chose Paul. Paul was not an accident. In addition to that, we can see that by that adoption we have a relationship with God. It's not just about get saved and you're done. It's a matter of a complete change of life and a relationship with God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. The fourth thing that we can see, almost held up 3 fingers, but I got it right today. I'm getting those fingers down. They'll work after a while. All right, now that I've got counting down, the fourth thing that I saw, that we see in this, is that God has a plan for you and for me. Every single one of us, God has a plan for. It's not, if we are a believer. It's not obvious a lot of times. Matter of fact, when I was in my 30s, I was saying, especially before I met Linda, I was saying to myself, okay, God, you've obviously forgotten about me and you must be crazy, but I know I'm your child, but I really don't get this because I don't see where I'm going. He still knew. He still had a plan. He knew I was going to go back to school when I was in my 40s. I was going to finish my college, go to seminary, go for several degrees in seminary. He knew all the things He had for me planned. And not only that, what's interesting is He actually set it up so that I would be successful in business first. And I think for 2 reasons. Number one, so that I would have the income so that I wouldn't have to go to a church and say, please give me money so I can preach. Okay? That's something God set up. That's not something I set up. Number 2, in addition to that, I think it put me through things that I never could have understood how other people have felt, and I can relate to people in ways I couldn't relate to people because of what I went through. God allowed that. Same thing He did with Paul. While Paul was killing people, he was still being prepared to be the apostle to the Gentiles. But here's the point. It's not just me and it's not just Paul. If you are a believer, and that's the key, if you are an adopted child, if you are a believer, that means you have a relationship with God, and that means that God has a plan for you, period. No such thing as spare parts, okay? He's got a plan for you specifically, and He knows what that... You may not know what it is yet, but He's got it. In addition to that, the last thing here that I want to point out is that our purpose in all this, the purpose for God choosing us, the purpose for the relationship, is so that we can glorify God. Not only do we see that in Ephesians 1:12, but in addition to that, look here in verse 24, the people saw what happened with Paul and they were glorifying God. Paul was glorifying God by his actions. The fact is that we by our actions should be glorifying and demonstrating God. Now, there's something that I really don't want to share with you, but I'm going to anyway. Because I think it's important to show something. And it happened to me yesterday. While I'm working on this sermon for how to glorify God, I was in a spot where someone in a grocery store did something several times to me that was just outrageous. And finally, not only that, but I didn't say a word to them, and finally the person also starts saying stuff to me which was outrageous as well. And finally, I just turned around and I lost it. I didn't yell at them, but I did look at that person and finally just said, "You pig," and turned around and walked away. I'll tell you something. Number one, did she deserve it? Absolutely, no question at all. She deserved a lot worse than that. Let me say this. "You pig" was highly edited. Okay? She deserved it. Number 2, was it sin? Well, we can debate that one, but honestly, I've gone back and forth on that, and I'll tell you why. It's okay to confront people. I'm not sure it's okay to confront them that way, but it's okay to confront people when they're doing stuff that's wrong. You can walk away or you can confront them, take your pick, but it's not necessarily wrong to say something that sounds inappropriate at first. But the third one I had to think about is, did it glorify God? And I think that's the one where I got to say, probably not in this case. I think we can go more than probably, actually. The fact is that in my own right to defend myself, I had a right to say what I said. Then, as I said, what I said was actually mild compared to what she was doing. But the fact is that it probably did not look good, not only to her, but if anybody else saw it. The problem is, anybody who saw that would have seen us come out of an aisle and then seen me say, "You pig," without knowing what had happened in that aisle, because there was only two of us in that aisle. So, and again, at least I didn't yell it, but the point is that it didn't glorify God. Had I do it over again? Would I have confronted her? Yeah, I probably would have. But I wouldn't have said that, and I wouldn't have called her a name. And frankly, had I had time to think about it then, I wouldn't have. I have to admit, one of the things that probably pushed me a little closer to the edge was the fact that right before I went into a store, I had to slam on my brakes and hit the horn because a person in the parking lot went through a stop sign at about 40 miles an hour, even though I had the right of way, and literally came this close to taking the whole front end of my car off. It wasn't her, it was somebody else. But the point is, when I look back on it, did that glorify God? Nope. Shouldn't have done it from that standpoint. From my own personal standpoint, who cares? Different, maybe. But from a standpoint of, did it glorify God? No. My action should be glorifying God no matter what I'm doing. And hopefully the next time and I will say this, just to let you know, that is not a habit. It's literally the first time I've ever said something like that to a person in my life. So don't worry, it's not something that happens frequently. And again, I hate to even share it because it's embarrassing to me. But by the same token, I think it's important for me to tell you the truth. And the truth is, yeah, somebody got under my skin yesterday, and I didn't glorify God when I was doing it. Now, if you've listened to this message and the other messages in Colossians and the message in Galatians and the message we've had before that, there are two things you have probably heard over and over again, and hopefully you're not sick of hearing them. But the two things are glorify God and relationship. And they've been repeated over and over and over again. And I hate to break this to you, but you're going to hear them more as time goes on if I'm still up here. Because the fact is, I think the two most important things that we overlook is the fact that salvation is not just fire insurance. Salvation is a relationship that's established. And the gospel is not just the gospel for, okay, you're saved and that's it. The gospel is the change at the moment of salvation that leads to a lifelong relationship with God and changes us throughout. That's the gospel. That's the message that's coming through, that the power of Jesus Christ can change us completely because of what He's done. And that the purpose of all that is to glorify God. That's why you keep hearing relationship and glorify God. They're related to each other, and as far as I'm concerned, the heart of the gospel is that a believer should have a relationship with God, has a relationship with God as a believer, and that our duty is to glorify God in what we do.